Really appreciate everybody joining. My name is Bethany Teachman, and I am a professor and the director of clinical training at University of Virginia. And I co-direct the initiative at University of Virginia called TIDE, which stands for Thriving Youth in a Digital Environment. And we are really drawn to try to figure out answers to two key questions. The first is, given youth are developing in a digital context, how can we more fully understand the impacts of that content? So what are the positive effects of social media, the negative effects, and in what cases are technologies really just another context in which youth are developing? And then secondarily, we want to understand, given youth are developing in this digital context, can we leverage that in order to increase access to mental health care for youth? And it's this latter question that I think is really guiding our discussion today. We are thrilled to be partnering with therapists in tech because we share an interest in trying to think about how we can offer training opportunities and allow people who are interested in the digital mental health field and potentially pursuing careers in that field to get more exposure to understand what the different opportunities are and how they can explore those opportunities. So I am thrilled today to have Tim Campolone, who will be moderating the discussion today. And Tim has been in many different roles and is a well-known figure in the field, currently working at health products with Apple and serves as an advisor to therapists in tech and has really done a lot of work in the training space. And so thrilled to have him joining us. And then he will be interviewing Kate Wolin. And I know that's who you've all come to see. We're thrilled to have her joining. She is an entrepreneurial leader at the intersection of population health science and business for over 20 years, a pioneer in bringing scientific evidence into compelling digital health products, and really an expert in developing technology-enabled health behavior change programs, personalized digital health products that can engage and retain consumers, and that can really improve population health outcomes. So she's highly accomplished. We're going to learn a lot today. She's authored over 75 peer-reviewed publications, secured external funding, and named as a Forbes Healthcare Innovator that you should know. In addition, she has been principal owner of Circea since 2019, which guides clients in threading the needle between evidence and commercialization in digital health. So welcome, Kate. We're really glad to have you here.
Thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulties, but glad I could get here.
No, absolutely. And I think Tim should be coming out as well, but maybe experiencing some other technical difficulties. So I can go ahead and get us started. Do you want to tell folks a little bit about your professional journey and what that has looked like?
Very, very nonlinear. The awesome thing about the world today is that I get to encounter more and more people who have had a nonlinear career path. But I didn't have anyone to look to at the time. But I went into academia thinking I wanted to be an academic and was really excited about that. So my first job out of college was at an academic medical center at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute in Boston. I had the opportunity to work on a number of projects, including a bunch of community-based research work with what was then called the Center for Community-Based Research. So behavioral science trained folks who were doing intervention research in community-based settings and workplace settings to change cancer risk behaviors. So smoking, physical activity, diet, weight management. And it was awesome. Like I got to read papers. It was great. I landed there because I had this awesome internship with the Department of Public Health as a college student. And I was like, this is what I wanted to do. I applied to grad school. I continued to work there through grad school. And it was like, this is the path I'm going to be on. Right. And I loved the certainty of it. Right. It was, I knew if you got these papers and you got these grants, you were going to get the job, get the promotion. And all of that was actually delightful. I loved it. So I finished grad school. I had focused a lot on the health behavior side of things, even though I was in the epi department, and wanted to sort of understand intermediate endpoints and outcomes before you sort of got to diagnosis. So took a postdoctoral fellowship opportunity at Northwestern in preventive medicine, working with a faculty member who was focused on doing a lot of work with biomarkers. And I thought that would be a really nice complementary skill set to sort of round myself out when I went to start applying for grants. And it was a great experience. I then began my faculty job search, ended up taking a role in the Department of Surgery, oddly enough, at WashU in St. Louis. Very weird place for a population health scientist to be. But the chair of surgery was also the head of the cancer center and really wanted to build the outcomes research capability. So had recruited my grad school advisor to build that out. And so I went and joined there. And again, sort of got to do a lot of really interesting things, was quite happy for some time. So unlike a lot of folks now who are smart and figure out that they want to do something outside in grad school, my journey was a little bit longer. It actually, I joke that like tenure was my as good as it gets moment. And I'd had a couple of them kind of leading up to that. But for me, it was this sense of I was really interested in how you take something that works in one setting and like does it work in another right, and sort of not the science of dissemination and implementation, but actually like does this solution that works for the cancer survivors who live in St. Louis work as well when you take it down to the boot heel of Missouri and you've got one YMCA in a 9-county area, right? And that really was a question and an opportunity that in 2010, 2012, like digital strategies, right? Tech was sort of an opportunity to sort of lean into there, right? Like, oh, like, could you do some of this remotely? I actually went back and went to coding boot camp because I was trying to build a digital solution and I had no idea what it took to do it. And I kind of had this mindset of, okay, I might not understand everything that our top biostatisticians are doing, but I was a biostat minor and I understand enough to know that it's the right path, right? And that like if my name is the PI on this grant, that this is the right statistical strategy. And I did not feel like I had that understanding when it came to building tech. And so I went to that coding boot camp. I was twice as old as everyone else there. They all wanted to be the next Mark Zuckerberg and build Facebook for X. And I was like, oh, I'm trying to build an app that allows my cancer survivors to track their strength training activity the same way that they can do with a like Gen 1 Fitbit that grew the little flower on it, which probably no one has ever seen besides me. Right. But like, we can do that with like cardiovascular activity. How do we do that with strength training activity? And like, that was why I was there. But it got me thinking about how startup founders think about building a solution that scales, which was really, really different from how population health scientists who were talking about like scaling and disseminating within the context of like a public health system. And so it just really like pushed my thinking. I had the opportunity to go on a national television program whose host has had a wild journey in healthcare and now runs CMS. But they're talking about the relationship between obesity and cancer. And of course, like my parents were thrilled, right? They had all their friends over to watch the show when it aired. And my dad called me afterwards and said, I didn't know obesity was related to cancer. And this for me was like this defining moment of like, I've been working at the intersection of obesity and obesity related behaviors and their relationship with cancer prevention and survivorship for at that point, a decade. And my dad has no idea that there's any connection between those two things. Like I am not having the impact I think I'm having, right? Like it just sort of was like I joke about it being like, am I as good as it gets moments, but like, you're really like, if I'm in this to have an impact, am I having an impact? Right? Is the world understanding the work that we do? And I think everyone has those moments at some point in their journey, and they do logical, insane things with that. For me, it just sort of led to a lot of conversations with colleagues I was close to about, like, what are we doing, right? Like, is our work getting out there? Is it getting implemented? How is it getting implemented? And my longtime friend and colleague, Gary Bennett, had founded a startup, came back to academia, and he called me one day and said, "Hey, you keep talking about this. We just wrapped a clinical trial of a solution that I think can scale, right? Can do these things that you talk about in like a cost-effective way. Will you meet with the team, right, as we decide what's next? Like, should we write an R01? Do we, what do we do with it?" And I met with them and I was like, please don't write an R01. Like, please, get this out into the world. And Gary's, we have like sort of a teasing sibling like relationship sometimes. He's like, great, you'll do it. And I was like, me? Like, what do you mean? He's like, no, you'll do it. So, he and I, along with Jory Steinberg, who had been in Gary's lab working on that trial, started working on it nights and weekends. Again, everything in my journey is like a lesson in on paper what not to do, right? So 3 people who all have toddlers and full-time jobs working nights and weekends to try and put together the concept for a business is like not a plan anyone on paper would look at and be like, sounds like a great idea. But we did, and we were really excited about it. And as we were working on that, we got a call from someone who had read the paper that their team had published, wanted to learn more. And, to save this being an hour and a half long story, we started having conversations with people as we were building it. And it hit a point where we had enough to do and enough interest that someone needed to be in the business full time. And so Gary was right. It was me. Right. And so I quit my job to become a startup founder. I'd never done that before, wasn't on my bingo card, wasn't the kid with the lemonade stand who wanted to do it. Certainly wasn't the thing my dad was excited to hear. Thankfully, I make decisions for me, him. And I think, and it was great, right? Like it was hard. It was the hardest job I've ever had. But it was also incredibly rewarding. And ultimately, we were successful. We started 3 months in after we launched the project. I was onboarding 10,000 patients a month onto our platform, right? And what I said at the time was like, if my goal is impact, I might have delivered between the intervention and control arm, and interventions to 10,000 patients in my entire career is a best case scenario in academia. So, that is incredibly rewarding. We built a successful business. The company was acquired by Anthem, which is now Elevance, an insurance company, 3 years after we launched it, right? So that was all great. But one of the things I've learned in talking to people who are in academia along the way is how many misconceptions there are about, that journey. And so the first one was I was probably 9 months in, and I got asked to come give a talk and bumped into a number of colleagues I deeply respected from the time that I was still in academia. And they were like, oh, this must be great. Like, you're getting well paid. You don't have to worry about funding. And I was like, hold up. The 3 of you are tenured faculty members, right? Like, I didn't get paid. I didn't take a penny in compensation for the first 6 months that I was running this startup. Right. And when I did get paid, it was a fraction of what I was making as a junior faculty member, let alone a full professor with tenure. So it's just, I think there's a lot of misconceptions about what that can be like. On the flip side, right, you can get a great job if you're not a startup founder in industry. But I think there's also this perception that people in industry are making a lot more than people in academia. And I think the reality is there's a spread in both of them, right? So when I knew people who took faculty positions as their first faculty job that paid $60,000 when I left, when I was leaving academia, to people who are making $120,000, right? Like that's a huge delta in difference of what a first faculty position would make. And the same can be true in industry jobs. So for me, it was just a lot of interesting things of me, like not knowing what I was doing, not really having a plan all the time. but I don't regret it. It was great.
Well, I'll let Tim follow up. I'm sure everybody has a million questions, but thanks for getting us started, Kate. What an amazing journey that you have had.
Yeah, and someone who has we've not had a chance to formally meet before, Kate. So it was great for me to hear a little bit about your journey, and certainly a little bit of resonance with the non-linear career path. I think for folks that joined this industry kind of earlier, or kind of in its inception, I feel like there is a lot of that feeling of trepidation of what am I doing? Is this the right path? There's not really a great model to follow. And I'm curious, just to kind of piggyback on that, what was it like for you? Like what kept you going? Because I know in my own journey, and maybe I should just introduce myself because I realize maybe people don't know who I am. I'm Tim Campolone. I'm a clinical psychologist by training. I've spent the last 8-ish years working at different digital therapeutic startups. So digital therapeutics are kind of digital mental health interventions intended for regulatory oversight in the States, usually by the FDA. And most recently, just left to join my first big tech company at Apple, which is where I'm coming to you live from Cupertino. And I also have been an advisor for Therapist in Tech, which is kind of where Tide and TNT intersect. Uh, Pretty much since its beginning, or since we were in the couple hundreds of people, we are now, I think, 4,000 members strong. It's a great community for folks. It used to be more focused on kind of clinicians in tech, but it's got a bit broader to any clinical intersection with the broader digital health industry. And it's really intended for people at all stages of their training. It's a free community to join, great resources, great people. But if you're considering it as a trainee, if you're looking to break in as a intern or a fellow, or if you're already there and looking to just build your network, great place to go.
I
So
think that's
yeah,
Tim, one of the most awesome things about that group is how it's evolved, right? From people who are in a clinical role almost exclusively like at behavioral health companies into folks who are now in product roles and user
yep,
research roles, right? Like, I mean, David and crew have done an amazing job about of building that community out, right? For people who maybe realize I don't want to stay in a clinical care delivery role, like what else
yep,
can I do, right? And finding people who are doing all kinds of amazing things in that community based on their training.
yeah. And to circle back to the question I was asking before I interrupted myself with my introduction, what kept you going in those early days
Oh.
when, things were uncertain, you were blazing a path where you didn't have a clear model or template to follow? But I'm just like what helped you keep going in those moments where you're like, am I doing the right thing? Is this the right moment to make this transition?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I think it's like a lot of the time, if I'm honest about it, like I didn't know enough to know better. Right. So like when I sold Scale Down, like
Yeah.
my best friend from college who is an MBA grad, right? Like works in consumer goods and like branding and product. And she's like, so you're gonna do it again? And I was like, oh hell no. Right. I mean, just like no, right? Like because on like nothing on paper says that this should have worked. And and I think that that is ultimately true, like everywhere I've been, right? Like I've been an advisor at FANG companies and worked with their like digital health teams at multiple of them. I've been done projects with multiple pharma companies and their digital health teams. I've worked with a number of startups at this point. I've been an investor, right? Like, and
Yeah.
on paper, most of the things that I am doing aren't supposed like shouldn't work, right? But
Yeah.
that's also what I love about them, right? Is like if I'm doing something that 15 people have done before, I've learned I don't find that enjoyable and satisfying, right? Like, because healthcare is broken, right? It's
Yeah.
easy to find problems in American healthcare system and frankly, globally in the healthcare system. So the fun part for me is like, what are we going to do different?
Yeah.
And I realized like that's the part I love. Like I took a job after we sold Scale Down with a private equity owned company that was like what we call growth stage. So they had a lot, millions and millions of dollars in revenue, profitable company. And the goal was like to grow this from
100 million to $1 billion in revenue.
Yeah.
And that's it's a different skill set, right? You're focused on not figuring out what works, but everyone at this company kind of accepts that like this is the thing that works, and like how are we going to make it a little bit better, right? So I think about the difference between being the team that built the first iPhone and the team
Yeah.
that's like currently doing iPhone today, right? For like, right, those are the people who are drawn to that, right? You still need amazing talent, right? But they're people who get lit up by doing different things, right? Like they like the people want to make it 5-10% better versus like I want to flip the table. And
Yep.
it turns out like I'm kind of a flip the table person. And so like that's the thing for me that like gets me to be excited about the next project is like it's a little bit higher risk, right, but I get more excited about it, and it's like why I want to go to work. And the thing I also am like very very transparent with people about is I am in a place to take that risk because I have a counterbalance in my household. Like my
Yeah.
husband works a very stable, very traditional job, and like he provides health insurance.
Yeah.
Right. And so like if I do a project and like it doesn't work out for my client and they're like, okay, we're going to go in a different direction. We don't need you anymore. And that happens at both big pharma companies and at startups. It's not just startups, right? Like then I'm like, okay, like I'm going to have like one less client for a period of time. And like that's like I can weather that, right? Like I've gotten comfortable weathering it from an emotional standpoint. I figured out how to plan financially to weather that. That's a really different, really, really different thing.
Yeah.
Like me taking a job as like the head of product at a startup, right? And like we're gonna, and that's still a risk. So, I've kind of done a bunch of those things. And what I've realized is just like I like building in the early stages and I'm very comfortable relative to a lot of people. And like it's never comfortable with that level
Yeah.
of risk.
One thing that stands out about kind of your career journey is you've had experience either directly building and leading companies or through kind of, consultant advisory capacities of companies at different stage and
Yep.
size. And I know my own experience when I took my first startup job, I hadn't really given any consideration to how the stage of a company vastly changes what your experience is. I have subsequently learned experientially that that makes a big difference. But I'm curious,
Yeah.
because I imagine folks in the audience that may be considering this, maybe similarly haven't given much thought to that. So if you could speak to just, generally, because you talk about like you're a flip the table kind of person, which certainly, maybe pulls for like an earlier stage experience where tables are ready to be
Mhm.
flipped. But I'm just curious kind of how your perspective on like how you consider, tailoring or approaching your work given the stage, the size of the company, and how that's changed over the course of your journey.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's one of the things people talk about, like if you're going to work in a startup, is like you kind of have to be comfortable with ambiguity, and it's true, right? But it's also like, well, what are you like? What is the company ambiguous about? And like what I can say is like when I've interacted with those companies, I am always, always most excited about working with a team where the problem they are trying to solve, everyone is really clear on, right? I like, because I'm not like, your solution may or may not be right, right? But are we deeply passionate about the problem we're trying to solve? And like, and not in like, I'm trying to solve cancer, right? Like, great, like we're all anti-cancer, cool, right? But like, what part of that problem are you trying to solve? And like, is everyone really clear on that? So like that's the part of it I think that is like interesting for me is like, is this a team that like is really passionate about the problem? And we all have a good level of commitment that like we understand the problem well enough that our thesis of the solution, right, we believe is going to work. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that I've been fortunate to find teams that are really like impact and mission focused when I've worked with startups. And I have also found those individuals at big companies. And I will say, like at big companies, I also find people who are dabbling in it. Like, I don't, I mean, I do, let's just say I don't mean it in a bad way as untrue, right? Like they are, right? Like they're frustrated with things about the big company because who isn't? Like there's bureaucracy, right? There's like, I mean, look, I spent 2 years at Optum and UHG. Like there are people there who are really, really passionate about fixing healthcare. And there are people there who are like, my job is to deliver profit, right? Like that's how I get promoted. And if we
Yeah.
don't deliver that, like I'm not going to get promoted. And like I want to help patients along the way, but like, and like, and so like I don't like throwing the baby out with the bathwater at big companies because I think there are a lot of people there who are really mission driven and doing really good work, right? But I think I've also experienced like people at those companies who are, like, oh, like I understand how to build a digital health app because like this app that I did for myself when I was trying to lose 5 pounds was like really effective. So like that's what we need to do. And
Yeah.
and I remember having a conversation with a product manager at a big tech company who had been in tech, and this was this person's first time working in healthcare. And and we're like chatting about how they're approaching like the physical activity promotion features in their product. And he was like, I just don't understand. Like, it's not hard. Like you just like people, you should just like go work out at your lunch hour. Like it's not difficult. I was like, am I the first person with curly hair you've ever met? Right. And he was like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you get a half hour. Like his hair was kind of like yours, Tim. And I was like, this takes a half hour, right? And I'm like, and there's a part of me that's like, like and I'm like, and I'm saying this as like as a white woman with curly hair. Like
Yeah.
you've clearly never talked to someone who is not a white woman with textured hair. If you think that's easy, like your lack of understanding of your user is like mind-boggling to me, right? And like that's the person leading the physical activity product feature development.
Yeah.
So, it's like, yeah, this person probably understands more about like the tech side of it than I ever will, but doesn't understand the user experience side of it, right? The patient, the person on the other side. And I think that's the thing that when you come out of a public health background, a psychology background, a therapy background, right? There's just this like user centered, empathy focused mindset that I think is so critical to digital health. And finding those people is always what makes me like like a team, a project, a
Yeah.
client, a job better.
Yeah. And maybe kind of pulling on that thread for a second. So you mentioned kind of training and skills and how that translates to the work. I'm curious, kind of maybe two questions. What are things you picked up in your training or when you were in grad school, skills that have served you the most well in your journey? And similarly, as transition into the role of starting a company, I imagine there were lots of things that you wish you had learned or picked up along the way in your training. So
Yeah.
maybe kind of on both sides of it. So what served you well and things you've retained or kind of continue to come up in your work,
Yeah.
and what was a blind spot that you didn't realize until it was kind of hitting you over the head?
So I love these questions because I think that, and I've had this conversation with a number of colleagues who have left academia to be in industry now. And I think that there are so many skills that you learn in grad school that you don't talk about in the same way that people talk about. So you have the skills, but you don't know to look in a job post. You don't know to use the right phrasing in an interview. So like I'm a public health person by training. Like we're trained to think in systems, right? We're trained to think about the context around something and all of the things, right? And I used to tease Gary, like I was like, all you do in behavioral science is boxology, right? You draw boxes and arrows, like, and like, but also that's what we do in epi and stats, right? You're trying to draw like the causal model, right? And
Mhm.
you're trying to draw the like intervention model, and these are these are the mediators and the modifiers, right? Like that's systems thinking, right? You're thinking about all these contextual factors. that is an enormously valuable skill, right? Like all of us are trained to like, you can kind of like, I can hone in on these like two boxes and the arrow between them, right? To do like a simple like t-test, right? Or I can think about like the whole system because I'm building this multivariable model, right? In stats, in right, whatever that is. That is enormously valuable in thinking about developing a product or a solution in
Mhm.
industry, right? Because part of that is like, you know, um, like the like firm, like what's the active ingredient, right? So like when you're going to design an intervention, right? If you're like doing an intervention trial for your like your PhD,
Yeah.
right? Like what is the thing that you're testing in that, right? Like that's kind of the like that's the active ingredient, right? To know that, but then to also know what are these other things that are going to influence it that I have to control for, that I have to adjust for in my analysis, right? You are by design thinking about the system. And I think that is an enormously valuable skill in building a product, in evaluating a product, right? In selling a product to tell the story of like why this is an important thing, whether you're like selling to a customer or pitching to an investor, um, or your boss or whoever for funding, right? Like that is very, very valuable. And like the language to describe it has changed over time. Right, but it comes into play if you're like you and I'm old enough when I trained, we called it health disparities. Right now, it's social
Mhm.
determinants of health. It's the same thing. It's the context, it's the system, it's all of these things, right? And you've learned to think about those in grad school, right? Like it is part of your training, and it's enormously valuable because you actually like see all the things, and you don't even know
Yeah.
it's a skill that other people don't have, but it's incredibly valuable. I think the other is like the mixed methods, right? That like we learn qualitative and quantitative research as part of our training in most of these graduate programs, right? You might love one or the other, right? But you've learned that skill set. And part of that skill set is like defining the hypothesis, right? Like defining the important variables and factors, right? Like doing all that systems thinking, planning a research project, right? Is project planning, right? So like
Yep.
you're actually learning these really functional skills of like how to plan and execute a project, right? When you plan and execute a study. Now you might not think about that, like, because you're like, oh, all I know how to do is research. Like, no, like you knew how to take your PI, like your advisor's
Yeah.
grant, right? Put together a project plan to execute this, right? Write it out, like make a project plan. Here's my timeline, right? And I was like, I didn't know what a Gantt chart was until I was like 10 years into like industry, right? And I
Yeah.
was like, but there's a Gantt chart in every NIH grant that I have ever written, been on, reviewed, right? Like we just it's a timeline, it's a project
Yep.
plan, like you know, it's just these funny things like and I would sit in these and I remember um first faculty physician being in a meeting with my like advisor, my boss, my mentor, and he was like, oh, I really think you should look at using IVR for this. And I was like, I do IVR is, but I'm clearly supposed to know what IVR is,
Yeah.
right? And I like got like, and he's like, you know, Gary did that in his thing. So I like call Gary and I'm like, Gary, like what is IVR? And he's like, interactive voice response, like you know when you call, and this is like for the record like 2006, right? So it's like you like you call the airline,
Yeah.
and like because the airline were the only people who had IVR at the time, right? And like you say like you want the arrival time for flight 1747, and they like give it to you. That's IVR. And I was like, oh, because like you know so and so was saying like we really need. He's like so and so has never done IVR. So and so has no idea if IVR is the right thing. But so and so
Yeah.
heard me say IVR in a meeting, and I was like, this is why I love you, Gary, and we're good friends, right? But I think it's these things like I also learned like the imposter syndrome will eat you alive if you let it,
Yeah.
right? And so you sit in these meetings and someone's like, we need a Gantt chart, right? And you're just like, Gantt chart, right? Google Gantt chart. Oh, okay, I know how to do that, right? Like it's easy to get sort of intimidated by it, but also like when you're interviewing for a job, like I wouldn't know to tell people that like I know how to make a project plan, but I know
Yeah.
how to make a project plan.
Yeah.
Um, so I think like that skill set is useful. I think the things I um did not know. I think number one is the value of marketing, PR, like whatever you want to call that
Mhm.
circle of things. My inclination was to not put anything in front of anyone until it was polished. ready to go. And like, I could back it up with 100 data points, right? Thank you, reviewer two. You crushed me, right?
Yeah.
Like you like, and the reality is in the startup world in particular, but even like internally, right? Like when you're at a big company, like you've got to do like what I would call whip the votes if you're on Capitol
Hmm.
Hill, right? But like you've got to build, you've got to tell the story, you've got to get people excited about what you're doing. And to do that, you have to talk about it before it's done. Because then
Yep.
part of what you're doing is actually showing the momentum. Like, oh, here's the thing we're going to do this year, right? And like, and then like, you know, a month later, they're like, oh, like, you know, oh, like we've already done that, right? And you're like building the enthusiasm. Um, and I just didn't appreciate the value of that at all. And
Yeah.
I think it's even if you stay in academia, like you're going to have to do that with your department chair and your dean. My lab is doing all these exciting things, and we've got this amazing grad student that just interviewed, and this is why you need to give my lab the extra dollars next year instead of Tim's lab, right? Like
Yeah.
it's actually something that is important skill in every job, and I did not appreciate it at
Yeah.
all in the early days of my startup, right? So I was heads down building, and like bro over here like was like, I'm crushing it. And he was like hyping himself up. And I was just like, you know, and like, did I have a better product and a better company at the end of the day? Yeah, I sure did. But no one knew it because I wasn't talking about it.
Yeah. Maybe one more question, and then for folks that have questions, start putting them in the Q&A queue, and we'll turn to those next. But maybe a question to end on. I mean, you talked a little bit about when you were starting out, just kind of like, this we were at the very early stages of clinically trained researchers or people entering into industry. And obviously, we've seen a bit of a explosion in digital health, digital mental health. But certainly now for people that are trying to enter, the headwinds and the barriers and challenges are different.
Yep.
And I'm just like, what advice would you give to the audience here for folks that might be considering now entering into this space to try to set them up for success?
Um, you have to have more um than the clinical knowledge, right? Like because the my friend Claire Purvis, who runs the Well Women program, was talking about this recently, and she's right? Like the reality is like it is different, right? There are a lot of people who have a PhD, say in clinical psychology, that are looking for jobs in industry. So what is the skill set beyond I have a PhD in clinical psychology? And like that, it's not an unvaluable skill set. It's an incredibly valuable skill set, right? But being able to tell someone, um, this is what you need to do to provide therapy to adolescents is helpful.
Hmm.
There are a lot of people who can do that, right? Being able to say, these are the risks in providing therapy to adolescents online is valuable. Again, a lot of people can do that. Being able to say, these are the risks, and here are 3 ideas for how we might manage them, and here's how I would rank those risks in importance, right? For the ones most likely to happen and the biggest risk and impact to our business if we get it wrong. That's moving you from clinical expertise to strategic thinking.
Hmm.
And I think it's the same thing. Like a lawyer can come in and be like, that's a legal risk. The lawyers I love working with are the ones who are like, that's a legal risk. Like, here are the parts of it that are the biggest legal risk if you want to think about how you might mitigate those. And I can then help you figure out if those are viable risk mitigation strategies, right? They become a strategic thought partner. They're not just like a no. And I think one of the things that tends to happen with scientists, because it's actually how we're trained, is we're really good at finding the like risks and being like, this is why it's going to fail. And this is what, right? We go into reviewer two mode. And lots of people can be reviewer two, right? Like, what do you do after your reviewer two, which is actually not what we're trained to do as reviewer two.
Yeah.
And so like that's like the thinking, I think, if you want to come into it, because like, I think it's if you want to work with a startup, right, and be their clinical voice or their scientific voice, right, no one on their team needs someone who comes in and just tells them all the things they're doing wrong.
Yeah.
It's easy. It's actually, that is the easiest job I've ever had, is to come in and tell people what they're doing wrong. It's not actually helpful.
And one of the things that I learned early in my startup career was business. It's like, I think I love what you just said, because it's saying what the risks are and the mitigations, but knowing that the business is incentivized to take on certain risks, and because it means you can go faster. And so it's not to say, it's like, put it in terms of reviewer too. You may strategically just not address or make changes that the reviewer called out, which is maybe antithetical to how we all treat peer review, where it's like line by line, here's how I've
Mhm.
addressed this, but it's like,
Mhm.
no, I'm just going to ignore this
Yeah.
and see if you on the next round of review call me out for having ignored your feedback,
Right.
and see. And so it is just a different way of approaching things. I love that that piece of advice. Okay, so I'll read the questions out just for the record here. So I'll start with Rachel's question. I'm a mid-career child psychologist, and I'm interested in being a research and clinical voice at the table of how AI and tech are evolving in how they work with kids in safe and efficacious ways. I've wanted to get involved in consulting or ad boards. Is that needed? Any advice on how to find part-time opportunities without having experience in this space?
Ooh, this is a great question. So, is it needed? Yes. Do those teams know that they need it? Not always. Right. And I think this is where the conversation, Tim, that you and I were just having comes
Yeah.
in, right? Is uh they're going to be looking for people who say, hey, we're willing to take some risk, right? Because we believe, right, like we believe AI has a place to add value. So I'll give you an example, not related to kids, but was
Mhm.
talking with friend of mine, not work friend, but a personal life friend, who runs a large counseling group. And she said, like I believe that part of the value in charting and note taking for a clinician is that they process the encounter, right? Like that's the whole thing of like writing is part of your
Mm.
processing. Um, and so if all of the charting and documenting is done by an AI scribe, that the therapist loses something in making the encounter better for the patient the next time. And then it's a risk to the patient experience and the therapist's provider's growth. And I was like, oh, that's a really interesting perspective that I hadn't heard someone say before about using AI, right, for that example. And I was like,
Mhm.
does it have to be either or? Was my question back to her, right? Like, could you use the AI for the documentation to the insurance company? Because dealing with insurance is every clinician, behavioral health or not, least enjoyable part of their job, right? And so it helps with the documentation, but there's still an expectation that the therapist is taking notes and doing some charting of their own for their own purpose, right? But how they feel about that charting is different because it's not for the insurance company, right? So like the intrinsic motivation and the
Mm.
satisfaction, right, feels different. And she was like, "Oh, I could see that." Right? And so to me, like that's the like those kind of conversations where it's not just pointing out all the risks of AI, but it's like, well, like what are the different reasons? Like, how would that work? Right? It's more of like a how might we brainstorm mindset around
Yeah.
it than like a let me like and so I think that's what that kind of thing is what makes people who are great advisory board members, right, is they're thinking about that, or they're providing input on things they've seen that have worked in adjacent spaces versus coming in and just telling the team like what they're doing right or wrong. As to
Yeah.
how you find those opportunities, so one, advisory board work doesn't always pay well. So I think there's this idea that like, and no assumptions about you, Rachel, right? But from prior conversations, this idea that it's going to be this awesome, like additional revenue stream for you as an individual. And I would say like it can be very time consuming, and yeah, like it's some money, but it's time I'm not spending on something else, right? And like my kids, my marriage, my friends, whatever else. So, it may not be extremely lucrative, but take up a good amount of your time. I have found all of mine like through my network. And
Mm.
so I think it's the sort of thing of like, you kind of have to have a longer game plan for it of are you connected with people who are working in health tech, right? Who are at these companies? Like, are you going to, digital health related meetups and events in your area where you're talking to people? Are you going to conferences, right? Like in behavioral health, right? Like Salome's behavioral health tech conference, where you're going to meet people who are doing that work. And like if you're not, right, then like it's kind of hard for those people to know that like you're going to be the sane helpful voice on their board, right? Like, and so I think like that's the part of it is like kind of like the inclination is to find people who are going to be thought leaders, who are thought leaders for advisory board roles. And so like I think you kind of have to think of it as like a longer term strategy to like establishing yourself as that, and then people find you. On the consulting side, I think that's a similar thing where people are like, hey, I'm looking for someone who can come in and like embed in with our team for 6 months on this project, um, and provide that input. And so I think those are also things that you tend to find through a friend. Uh-oh, did we lose Tim? You're just stuck with me. I'll just keep going, given that, if that's okay. Abby and moderating team, Bethany. Should I just keep going? Should I read the question myself?
I just came in. I'm not sure what's going on. We're having some
Okay.
technical issues today, but that's
Great.
how it goes. But
I'll
yeah,
just
go
I'll
for it.
read
Let's
the
hear
anonymous question then. So for early career professionals who are looking to work primarily in industry, what is the cost benefit of spending 5 to 10 years in a clinical psych program? Would you still be able to have movement in their career with just a bachelor's or experience working in operations, product, or project management roles? Yes. So I don't think there's a right answer here. And I love that you're actually asking the question, given all the funding issues that we're seeing at the moment. I work on a team right now where there are 2 people that the team considers to have behavioral science expertise. One of them has a bachelor's degree and has been in industry on teams with PhD and non-PhD people for like 10 years. So I would say has more of an applied behavioral science background than and then there's a PhD level clinical psychologist on the team, and they bring complementary skill sets to the experience design part of the product development process. Right, the clinical psych trained person brings a lot of knowledge of like COM-B and the scientific research behind behavior change, is great at going and finding the papers on PubMed and sort of saying like, okay, in this intervention study, right, like that active ingredient, right? And the other person has sort of been in product management and experience design for 10 years. And so she's much more focused on like, how do we take that and implement it, like prioritize features, prioritize elements of the experience, and sort of tends to be the, hey, like if I love to talk about Heather's like big E little E, right? Like and so she's the one who's like, hey, if we can't get people to engage with the product, we're never going to get them to engage in the behavior, right? And the PhD clinical scientist is very focused on like, we got to get them to engage in this behavior to get the clinical outcome. And it's a really nice complementary skill set on my team that I'm working with on this project, and I love it. I love the difference in that skill set. So I think you can be very successful in industry without a PhD, if you want to be in those type of roles. I think there's value in the PhD, but I also like, I love that you're thinking about the cost benefit, right? Like awesome mindset to bring to industry. And I think, I think the thing is like, you're going to have spent all of this money on a degree. And like, at the end of the day, you might end up in a job that pays about the same as someone with a bachelor's or master's initially. I think you can ultimately get into different jobs with a PhD, but like your first job in industry may not actually like fully appreciate your PhD in some cases. I don't know, Tim, if you would disagree from what you've seen.
No, I similar sentiment. Again, I think this is where also just taking into account just like the current market. I think there's just because there are so many people that are interested and increasingly fewer and fewer jobs, unfortunately, people will, the economics favor the employer over the employee at this stage. And so even if you did have exceptional talents, there are lots of people vying and are willing to leave money on the table to take these jobs. So it's the unfortunate reality of just the present moment. And I think it's important context as you make big life decisions.
Yeah. Um, so the next question I think is kind of related to that too. Is there like a ceiling for salaries and roles for people who don't have a graduate degree? And I would say if your goal is to be the chief clinical officer at a company, it's going to be hard to get that role without a PhD level training, right? Whether that's an MD in psychiatry or a PhD of some kind. If your goal is to lead product and experience, I would say almost none of them have a PhD. Most of them probably only have a bachelor's degree. And, in the experience officers maybe have a master's of some kind. But like I would say, in the times that I've been in an experience or product leader role, it is unusual that I have that level of training. Similarly with CEOs, I would say what is more common, even in healthcare, is that even if a founder is an MD or a PhD, at some point they move out of the CEO role and into a scientific or clinical strategy role. And the organization brings in someone who has more of a business background. Now, over time, right, like they may develop that skill. It happens, it's not impossible. But it just tends to be like what people who are drawn to clinical training, right, get excited about, right? We get excited about the product and less excited about going and talking to venture capitalists about funding the business.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add there is I think one thing I didn't realize when I joined startups is a lot of the way that you can increase your earning power is by transitioning companies and looking for new roles and leveraging those moments to go from one to the other to seek an additional title bump or kind of renegotiate or kind of reset your market value, which is very different if you come to a mindset of, oh, I'll get a job, I'll get tenure, and I will be there for 30 years. And so there is certainly there are instances, and I have people, friends in my network that have stayed at the same job for a long period of time, but that is the exception. Most people are, I would say, anywhere between every 2 to 4 years are kind of looking for new jobs. And that's either because you've reached the ceiling of what you can do in your role and you feel like you're stagnating in terms of your growth from a skill standpoint, or you reach a point where there's just no next step on that career ladder, or if you're be most startups don't even have career ladders at earlier stage companies, then you just kind of have to, by virtue of just wanting to kind of get what you think you're worth, leave and find somewhere else to work. So it's just a different mindset. But I think it's important to call it because it was something I was not expecting
Such a
and
good
has
call
been,
out.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, right in academia, the branches are like, am I going to get tenure? Right? Am I going to become a department chair? Right? Am I going to like do something beyond that? And like those are the times that people, right? Am I going to get an endowed chair? Right? But there's like a handful of branches where people tend to leave an academic institution, and it's so different in industry. It's a great call.
Yeah.
As we get close to wrapping up, I wonder if I could ask a question to you first, Kate, but then would love to hear your perspective as well, Tim. You've both referenced during this conversation sort of things that are unique to this particular moment or changes in the field that have happened and how that shifted. I guess my unfair question is to ask you to sort of, bring out your crystal ball, and because we've got a number of people who are at different, who are on the call who are at different stages of graduate training, stuff to do. And, there's a variety of stages, and then people who are already in the field, early career. What's your best guess about how the answers to your questions would need to be different 5 years from now relative to the advice that you're giving now? Because obviously, like the job landscape
Great
has
question.
shifted.
And I think what I would say is don't let that uncertainty scare you away from it, right? Because we've weathered a whole bunch of ups and downs in like health tech and industry over the years. And it still continues to grow. I think the thing that I would say will be unchanged is the value in a significant portion of the market on stuff that works. Right. And so the value of being able to show that your solution is anchored in science when you're starting, right, and then starts to have outcomes that you can show as you grow, I don't think that will go away. And so the value of people who value science and outcomes and evidence-based methods and approaches will be unchanged. I don't think that will go away.
100% agree with that. The thing I'll add is if you're not already exploring AI tools or getting conversant with AI and just how it works or how you think it could augment or be used as part of your daily workflow, I would encourage you to start considering that. Because if I think about the next 5 to 10 years, I mean, we see with ChatGPT being publicly available, how that's been an inflection point for the way companies approach business and thinking, and just where and how this tooling can be used, from coding co-pilots to kind of supporting people in data analysis. And now with the whole, vibe coding kind of approach, just like making it easier, tearing down barriers for people leveraging this technology to do things that would have been, a boot camp was like how you used to learn
Yep.
how to code. You would just go for an intensive. And now it's
Yep.
like, let me pull this thing up, let me prompt it, and it'll tell me exactly and build a repo for this
Yep.
entire app I want to build. So if I think about I know we're still kind of maybe relatively early in this cycle, but I just don't see these tools going away. I think eventually we'll all figure out where and how they fit into their roles, but I would encourage folks to embrace the change and try to figure out what's your perspective. How do you use this? Where do you think it shouldn't be used? Because I just don't see a future where this is not a big part of what your
Yeah.
day-to-day work life is like. Because I know employers or people that are concerned with profit margins are definitely thinking about it. So I think it's like the
100%.
more that you have an informed opinion from some experiential standpoint, the better.
Yeah, I think it's a great call it, Tim, because it makes it that question that's popped up is like what sort of skills and trainings to prioritize. And I think about an interview I did for a role at a large company, right, where I was given like a case, right, like go like off for 3 days, right, and think about how you would approach solving this problem, right, and like 8 years ago, I would have gone to PubMed and pulled a bunch of papers, right, about like how that problem has been solved in the scientific research and put it into a keynote because I hate PowerPoint. And right, and like designed a whole like, here's the science, and like I would have made some like janky graphics, right? And like now, right, like if you don't show up with like a Builder.io, lovable, whatever designed app that like showcases what those concepts would look like in a prototype, right? You're behind, right?
Mhm.
And I think that's the difference, right? 100%.
Yeah.
Well, the time has flown by. I wish we had more than the hour, but a huge, huge thank you to Kate and to Tim for this fantastic discussion, and appreciate everyone for joining and the great questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation in different forums. So thanks for
Thank you
sharing
for
your wisdom.
hosting.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Tim.
Stephanie. Nice to meet you, Kate. Take care, everyone.
Likewise. Bye.